All right, I see some viewers have popped up for the Faithfully Magazine live Q&A on CRT with Dr. Nathan Luis Cartagena. I'm Nicola, as some of you may already know. I'm Faithfully Magazine's founding editor and managing editor, and quite a few other things. And so I'm so glad you all could join us tonight. We wanted to make this exclusively for our Faithfully Magazine partners, just to say thanks for supporting our mission, for, helping to sustain us so that we could keep doing this good work. So thank all of you for showing up tonight. And let's see. So we're talking about CRT, which has been a big topic this year. It's not a new topic by any means, but we've been talking about it more and more. And so we felt like, this was a subject that we really needed to touch on, to take on, and just get some answers to demystify it, get rid of some of the confusion. So that's why we're taking this on, particularly as our first live virtual event. So I will be serving predominantly as a moderator in the chat, interacting with some of you who are in the chat, passing on some of your questions, which we're going to take near the end of the Q&A. And that's also, if you want to hop in the chat to submit a question or just interact or whatever, you will need a YouTube account. It's a painless process, but once you're able to sign into YouTube, you can hop into the chat, submit some questions, for myself even, or for Timothy, or for Dr. Cartagena. And also, for those of you who are already logged in, you should see a little icon at the bottom of the screen. It may say Stay Faithful. If you hover over that or click it, you can subscribe to the Faithfully Magazine YouTube channel. So let's see. Finally, I hope this conversation is edifying for all of us. Like I said, takes away some of the confusion and helps some of us to move forward in some good, positive ways on this topic and other related issues. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Timothy Cho, who's Faithfully Magazine's associate editor. Hey, Timothy.
Thanks, Nicola. And thanks, Nathan, for taking this time to talk about this really important topic of critical race theory. I think that term has been thrown around everywhere, from churches to even executive orders. So I think it's a very great time for us to discuss this and to hear from a critical race theory scholar about questions that we might have about these things. When you first sent your first interaction with us, back earlier on this year about critical race theory, it came at a really good time for me because the term critical race theory had been thrown around so many times. It's kind of a boogeyman, and I didn't really know what it was. And so I was always thinking, man, isn't there a Christian scholar who can help us to kind of navigate these murky waters? And so you just came at a really great time. So I just want to say first how much I have appreciated your three-piece, 3 articles, just breaking down so much nuance, so much charity and grace in all those pieces. So it's just a real great pleasure to be able to ask you some questions, just a bit about your background, your study of CRT, and even just maybe even questions about how Christians should even think about this topic as a whole. So I'd love to just begin with the first question. Can you just share a bit about yourself and your background? Like, who is Nathan Cartagena?
Thank you. Well, first, I need to give a shout out to Sister Nicola and to Brother Timothy. It's a joy to be with you all. I'm so honored to be the one that's participating in your first ever live Q&A. So the pressure's on. I hope to deliver the goods. I also want to salute the great work you all have been doing at Faithfully. And I have told many that it's a joy to be able to write for you all and to work with you all. And I'm so especially grateful for the ways that you've been caring for the racialized minorities in the church, and particularly in the United States. I also want to give a shout out to all those that are viewing or that will end up joining us. I thank you for taking time on your Friday afternoon/evening. And maybe it's even a different day because you're watching from some other country besides the United States and you're in a completely different set of time zones. Thank you for taking time to listen to us. And I pray that what we have to say will prove edifying and encouraging and enlightening and also challenging. I want to say one more thing before I answer the question, and that is, as one who has ancestors that are indigenous going way back, I think it's important to recognize the lands that one is on, the ancestral lands that one is on when one is talking. So I note that I'm coming from the ancestral lands of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, as I'm coming from Wheaton, Illinois. So to your question about myself, as I've given a little hint, I do have family going way back that are indigenous, and that's on my dad's side. My dad's family is from Puerto Rico. So his family consists of those that are from the Iberian Peninsula, so from Spain, Portugal, and also the Taínos that are on the island that we now call Puerto Rico. My mom's side, they are what we in Spanish would call Anglos. So they are those who immigrated from, in particular, Ireland and England, and settled in what is now called the Southern United States. And they are going to be racialized as white, whereas my dad's entire family is going to be racialized as Latinos and Latinas. So I'm in what we in Spanish would call a mestizo. I'm mixed. I have family heritages that are coming from very different racialized groups and coming from different regions in the United States, and coming from what some would call the old world and some would call the new world. Of course, we have reasons to resist some of those labels, but to give you a sense of some of my background. I was born and raised in the church. And part of this is because on both sides of my family, you find deeply committed Christians. So on my mom's side, where there are even some hillbillies, deeply committed Christians from the U.S. South. And my dad's side, deeply committed Christians. There you're going to find Roman Catholics and Protestants. On my mom's side, it's predominantly Protestants. I want to say one more thing about my background, and that is that because of my mixed heritage, I growing up in particular New Jersey. I wasn't born there. I was actually born in South Carolina, so my story is quite complicated. But I spent most of my childhood in New Jersey, and in New Jersey, being racialized as a Latino meant a lot. And I came from this family that wasn't only mixed, but there were all sorts of failures to deal with the racialized nature of the world, and that caused tremendous problems for me and my siblings. And there were time and again, especially my brother and I were like, why are people seeing us as black and they're treating us as black? And why do the Latinos and Latinas not associate with us if we don't speak as well, if we don't speak Spanish as well as they do? And man, nobody in the world thinks we're white. What in fact is going on? And there are times you'd be in one setting and we'd be racialized. We might be seen as white and treated as such. And there are times where other settings we were seen as black and treated as such. And it was jarring. It was disorienting. And this would happen whether I was in public school or I was at a park, or I might actually be at church. It was completely different racialized experiences, again, sometimes from one room to the next. So one of the questions that I found myself asking over and over again is, what should sanctification look like in a racialized world? What's it look like not only to take on the name of Christ, to follow Christ as Lord and Savior, but also to grow in godliness in what I was seeing as a racialized quagmire? And I had this question that haunted me in part because I couldn't find good answers where I was in New Jersey. So people were often trying to pretend that race wasn't an issue, or if they saw that it was an issue, I found one of two were of the main responses. One was assimilation. Okay, yeah, but let's and still in some senses let's pretend race isn't an issue. And I thought, okay, this isn't really helping. And then another was a sort of embracing of the racialization, but that it seemed to me was really thin, and what in race scholarship we would call essentialized. So there was a way in which there wasn't room to really reckon with what it would mean to think about race as a social construct, what it would mean to think about racialization as practices that shape one's identity in the world, not necessarily even things that you would choose, but things that people might hoist on you. So that was a key question that I had. And to answer that question, I've studied a lot of different things. I've studied moral philosophy. I've studied military ethics. I studied Thomas Aquinas, and I've studied race scholarship, and especially critical race theory. And I'm grateful that I'm currently at Wheaton College in Illinois, where I'm able to bring all of the things that I've studied to bear in class and in the research that I'm doing to try to help edify the church by answering, again, that question, what should sanctification look like in a racialized world?
That's great. Yeah, it's great to hear just your background of, there's a lot of moving parts there that have been coming together. I'd really love to hear how did the subject of race become kind of a focus for you, right? I mean, you mentioned Thomas Aquinas, you mentioned military studies, right?
Yeah.
How did race come on your radar?
Yeah, so one of the things you'll hear people that do PhDs say is research is all about me-search. So one of the main questions I was trying to figure out is how to make sense of my life. And I started out, to be honest, not really with many what we might call explicitly race-conscious resources. I started out with people who, at the time I didn't realize it, were trying to push me into assimilating in divisions of what I would call Anglo-Saxon whiteness and white normativity. And I didn't know that at the time, but I was asking, okay, well, what are the resources that the church has that I could glean from? And because people in my family members had served in the military, I was thinking about military ethics and so forth. But the more I studied race scholarship, the more I realized how much the church, white supremacy, conquest, military adventures, etc., were all bound up to what ended up being the creation of categories of race, the spreading of these categories of race all across the world. And I saw that, especially in the beginning, when you have people from Iberia, so Spain and Portugal, coming to what we now might call, for example, Latin America, I saw that these people were wrestling quite a lot with to what extent Thomas Aquinas' theology would support or in certain senses challenge / all out reject the treatment that the indigenous peoples were receiving from the hands of some of my ancestors. So I had ancestors that were at each other's throats, quite literally. So I was trying to figure out how to pull all of this together. And one of the things that happened, this is a work of providence, is I was just beginning my master's thesis program, master's program at Texas A&M. And I was at a philosophy potluck, and I was nervous. It's my first year. I don't know what I'm doing, trying to do a master's degree. And at this gathering, Dr. Tommy J. Curry is with his family. He sees, I suspect, me looking a hot mess and walks over and says, "Hey, my name's Dr. Curry. I'd like to introduce myself." And we start talking. And I could tell that Dr. Curry realized I was struggling with a lot of questions about race, racism, racialization. And when I shared that my dad's side of the family is from Puerto Rico, I think he knew you could use some literature that's going to help you to think about how laws in particular have shaped the relationships that you have because of the relationship that Puerto Rico has with the United States. And so he encouraged me to look into critical race theory. And that really was the beginning of my interest in pursuing at a higher level race scholarship, not just dabbling and trying to read as I could, but thinking, I want to be the sort of churchman that's drawing on the past, so doing retrievable projects, but also engaging what is cutting edge race scholarship. So I was interested in doing that, and then again blessed that this is one of the things that Wheaton College has hired me to do, to be a race scholar and a philosopher and a churchman, etc. So that's how some of those pieces came together.
That's great. And when we talk about when people talk about critical race theory, oftentimes it can seem sort of daunting and kind of nebulous and intellectual, academic. I think what a lot of people might be asking is, what's a good layman's term definition of critical race theory? Can you help us define a way for us, the people, to understand it?
Yes. So let me offer a definition, and then I'll unpack it. So this is the simplest definition of critical race theory I can come up with. Critical race theory is a legal movement aimed at understanding, resisting, and remediating how U.S. law and legal institutions such as law schools have fostered and perpetuated racism and white supremacy before and after Brown v. Board 1 and 2. So let me read it one more time. Critical race theory is a legal movement aimed at understanding, resisting, and remediating how U.S. law and legal institutions such as law schools, have fostered and perpetuated racism and white supremacy before and after Brown v. Board 1 and 2. So let me unpack that. First, critical race theory is a legal movement. It's not a single theory. It's not a single mode of analysis. It's not a single ideology. It's instead a movement that houses multiple traditions that themselves would house different theories, different ideologies, etc. So there's in fact diversity going all the way down in the legal movement. The second thing I want to note is that one of the main aims is to understand. So critical race theorists do what Cornel West called de-disciplinized social analysis. So they don't just stick to, say, history or what you might take to be standard legal text or psychology. And instead, they're drawing on history, psychology, sociology, philosophy, theology, and decolonial studies to understand how it is that racism, white supremacy were suffused throughout the United States. They also want to make sure that as they're understanding, they resist and remediate. So part of what goes on is this resisting work. Let's stop and impede racism and the perpetuation of white supremacy. But there's also attention to remediation. Let's make sure that we promote just and merciful solutions to the problems that attend forms of racism and white supremacy. So it's both resistance and remediation. Next, there's it's a legal movement that's focusing specifically in its origins. Now it's gone a bit global. So you can find people in the UK, for example, and India doing critical race theory. But at the beginning, it was really just U.S. centric. So it's focused on how U.S. law and legal institutions like law schools fostered and perpetuate racism. Now, one of the things that you can think of is this: as Christians, we would believe that all human beings are law-bound, and at least in two senses. One, we're bound by divine law. But in another sense, we're also bound by human laws, whatever societies we happen to live in. Now, we have questions about how those human laws relate to divine laws, and pretty much anybody that's any kind of theist has been asking questions about how those two things relate. But one of the things that critical race theorists want us to see is, yes, that's right, we need to take seriously that we're bound by human laws, and they're going to argue that laws serve to organize society. And that as they organize society, they maintain a society through legal and ideological coercion. Through physical and ideological coercion. So laws are the sorts of things that if something is a law, for example, you can get fined, or you could, in the United States still, you could get something all the way to the death penalty. And laws end up promoting certain visions of the country, of its inhabitants, etc. And for critical race theorists, one of the things that they want to stress is that the United States has, throughout its entire history, used laws, its peoples have used laws to establish a white republic, to establish what colonial scholars will call a pigmentocracy, a country and government principally for and run by racialized, those that are seen as racialized whites. So Kenneth Nunn, who's a critical race theorist, has said that laws have served to organize white society. So again, laws organizing society, and they help to maintain the societies that they're organizing through physical and ideological coercion. And the last thing I want to highlight is the emphasis on before and after Brown v. Board. So I've already said a little bit about how critical race theorists are going to argue, drawing on history in particular. The United States was established to be a pigmentocracy. It was established to be a country for and by those racialized as whites. And you can see this is the case if you look at the naturalization laws in the United States. From 1790, when you get the first naturalization law, you get a clause, which is known as the racial prerequisite clause. It says only those that are white people can become citizens of the United States. The versions of that racial prerequisite clause run all the way to the Civil War, U.S. Civil War. Then after this U.S. Civil War, okay, now you can either be, if you're going to be a citizen, white or of African descent. But when people try to naturalize, they're routinely, outside of one case, when this goes to the Supreme Court, and to other cases at higher levels in the states, everybody's saying, "Oh, I should be a citizen because I'm white," because they're aware of the privileges and so forth that accompany whiteness. But it's not until 1952 and the McCarran-Walter Act that you finally get the abolition of the racial prerequisite clause. So from 1790 all the way to 1952, there's a racial prerequisite clause in the United States that ends up, again, after the Civil War, says, okay, you got to be white or, okay, of African descent and a descendant of slaves. So this is one of the reasons why scholars like Homey, Winnett and Winnett have said, okay, we have to see, and they're sociologists, we have to see the United States as not only a white republic, but as a kind of racial dictatorship. So the aim is to promote a vision of Anglo-Saxon superiority all across the land. You see this with things like Monroe Doctrine. You see this with visions of manifest destiny, etc. So you see that before Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board ends up being this important formal symbolic moment where the United States, through the Supreme Court, says, okay, we're going to actually start to break some of the modes of racial supremacy, racial dictatorship, racial apartheid, and we're going to have forms of desegregation. And we're going to try to make it so that perhaps for the first time, this will be a genuine multiracialized democracy. But the critical race theorists are going to ask, okay, but did desegregation, did it happen? How did it go? Did we do much to change the institutions that were bound up with all these forms of racial dictatorship? And then what should we make of the rise, in particular, of the Republican Party, intentionally designed to be the white man's party? And you get all of these dog whistles and so forth to make that happen. But from Barry Goldwater all the way, frankly, to present day, the Republican Party is trying to be the white man's party. So critical race theorists are going to say, hold on, we got to ask all sorts of tough questions about to what extent, if at all, forms of racism and white supremacy have indeed left, or are they present in law and legal institutions and sometimes obvious ways and other times subtle ways?
That's great. One of the ways that's helpful to define a term is to define what it isn't or what it might be responding to. So, the term critical race theory, it must be responding to something that came before it, right? So what is, I guess, uncritical race theory that critical race theory is trying to respond to?
It's a great question. I want to say we can tell two stories. They're related but importantly different. Two stories you'll find if you pay attention to the critical race theory literature. Here's story one. It's what I call Kimberly Crenshaw's story. Kimberly Crenshaw is going to argue that critical race theory is a movement that comes into its own in the late 1980s. And she's going to say it positions itself dialectically between two things. On the one hand, post-Brown v. Board, what she calls liberal race discourse. And on the other, what she calls, and rightly because it's a field, critical legal studies. Now, I've written about some of this in those essays that you all have published, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. Those that are more interested in what, in particular, critical legal studies is, I recommend that you go and look at those essays. But I want to start, remember, by saying that she says, okay, critical race theory is positioning itself between post-Brown v. Board, liberal race discourse, and then critical legal studies. So what does post-Brown v. Board racial legal discourse look like? Well, here's some features of it. There's an emphasis on being colorblind. There's a resistance to being race conscious. In fact, to be race conscious is often deemed to be racist. So you say, look, I'm black in some sense, or I'm a Latino and Latina in some sense. Oh, by noting that, you're promoting division, you're promoting forms of racism. There's going to be an emphasis on resisting racism, but not so much on remediating. So we want to stop bad actions. But if you really press us to remediate and to provide reparations, no, that's not a big concern. Racism is seen as a matter of individuals. It's seen as something that's connected to irrational prejudices, thoughts, and feelings. So there's not a systemic emphasis. There's certainly no emphasis on, for example, the whole United States being a pigmentocracy, a white nationalist project. No, that's not going to be the focus. And in fact, this is another important thing. That discourse is extremely ahistorical. So there's an ignoring of all the modes of white supremacy, all the legal modes to maintain white supremacy that have gone on. So it's more or less like, okay, we've desegregated, we're not a racial apartheid anymore, let's just pretend that's all in the past. In fact, we don't even need to pay attention to the past. This is why you can get some of these executive orders like the one for President Trump back in the fall, where you look at this and you go, what world are you talking about? Like, he doesn't even mention the dispossession of indigenous lands and extreme genocide of indigenous peoples. Doesn't mention anything about extreme imperialism, where you got the United States going to places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, the Philippines, all part of an effort to promote the white man's empire. And this is one reason why Rudyard Kipling was so proud of the United States. He says, yes, hooray, you're taking up the white man's burden. He has an infamous / famous poem called The White Man's Burden. So all that gets ignored. And then there's a shift from talking about race as biological to more subtle ways about talking about race in terms of cultures. Subtle ways of talking about race in terms of culture. So you might still talk about, for example, those that are racialized as black as inferior, or those that are that are going to be indigenous as inferior. But you're gonna find people talking about their cultures rather than, well, they're just born with these genetic defects, for example. So that's some of the post-Brown liberal discourse on race. And I want to highlight it's liberal discourse. It's not just conservative discourse. It's also, if you're thinking about two political categories, it's both political liberals and political conservatives. This is one of the things that they're resisting. And then there's what's known as critical legal studies. So critical legal studies that involves the rejection, which critical race theorists endorse, of seeing the law as neutral and apolitical. There's critical legal studies theorists are going to push against what's known as political liberalism, so a theory of of politics or tradition of politics, going back to somebody like Hobbes and picked up by Locke and Rousseau and somebody like Mill and John Rawls. So they're going to push against that. They're going to push against the right theories that are connected to that, and they're going to champion that the United States has forms of hegemony, but it has these, as it were, subtle ways of maintaining certain structures. Some of those are ideological, so through the ideas, the myths, and the stories that we tell, but also through modes of coercion, back to the law and how you might police, for example. But critical race theory say, okay, as much as all that's helpful, and we're actually going to resist some of it, you're not paying attention to race, you're not paying attention to racism, you're not paying attention to white supremacy. And you're not paying attention to how racialized minorities have used modes of political liberalism, somebody like Frederick Douglass, for example, and have used rights theory to promote forms of racial justice. You're just saying, nope, the whole thing's got to go. And so they're saying you're not paying attention to the distinctive ways in which we're being oppressed, we're being exploited in racialized terms, and you're also not paying attention to our histories, where we've used some of the discourse and some of the tools of political liberalism and rights rhetoric to promote justice. You're just telling us, nope, that all has to go. So I know it might seem like quite a lot, but that's just story one. That's story one. So it's seeing critical race theory as an alternative in important senses to that liberal discourse about race and critical legal studies. But here's the second story. Critical, and this is what I call the Richard Delgado, Tommy Curry story. Critical race theory is a movement that began with the work of Derek Bell and Alan Freeman in the 1970s. Bell is resisting integrationist positions and theories championed even by the NAACP and white liberals. Because Bell is saying, wait a second, we're actually not finding desegregations working. And these two groups, folks like the NAACP, folks like white liberals, keep pushing certain modes of desegregation, not paying attention to how much harm what they're championing is causing the communities that they're supposed to be advocates for. And somebody like Freeman is going to join Derek Bell and say, yeah, wait a second, we got to ask, how is it these modes of white supremacy and white hegemony and racial subordination, how are they maintained? And so Freeman ends up writing an important piece in the late 70s about how anti-discrimination law in the United States actually continues to perpetuate forms of racism. Now, I want to say this. It's true that the Crenshaw story will pay difference to Derek Bell, but there's not the same centering of Derek Bell and his work. And notice, the second story I've given you doesn't really say a whole lot about critical legal studies. You can end up saying, okay, well, those that inherit Derek Bell's projects, they're going to be the ones that are positioning it this way. But I want to highlight this because there are important questions to ask about whose scholarship and whose methods you're going to center and emphasize. So on the one hand, there's a kind of like a nod to Derek Bell. Yep, he was helpful. He was an important law professor, but somebody like Crenshaw is going to say, really, it's because of things that happened at Harvard after Derek Bell left, because of what Harvard students that were in Harvard Law School ended up doing. That's what's really going to count for critical race theory. But others are going to say, well, a lot of what that gets tied to is actually not really helpful, and it's not faithful to the founder that they're going to argue is Derek Bell. So there's a tension in terms of how to think about critical race theory. But last thing I'll note is this. Again, even with that tension, we have to see that critical race theorists, whether you take the Derek Bell story, sorry, just 1 second, I'll shut this off. Whether you take the Derek Bell story or you take the Delgado Curry story, it's the case that they're positioning themselves against political liberals and political conservatives. So critical race theory has never actually been all that desired. It's the sort of thing that people from a whole range of political perspectives were resisting.
And I think one of the terms that gets kind of put together with CRT is this idea of intersectionality. There's usually this association between that and critical race theory. Can you help us define what intersectionality is? And maybe are there ways we can think biblically about intersectionality where we might even see sort of the themes or the ideas of intersectionality in our Bibles?
Yeah, great question. I want to answer this question in 4 stages. So the first thing I want to note is that it's true, Kimberly Crenshaw invents the phrase intersectionality in her 1989 essay, Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex. But she does not identify the ideas that the phrase refers to. Those are ideas that actually go much further back into frankly, there are hints of it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I've written some about that in the essay. So I want to note first, we need to see that though Crenshaw invents the phrase intersectionality, the ideas that she is employing in that 89 piece had been around for decades before. Now, second thing I want to note is that there is not one definition for intersectionality. So some of us are like, man, CRT and intersectionality seems confusing. Yep, because there's not one definition for any of these things. And as you could tell from my two stories, not only are there different ways of thinking about it, but people are importantly committed to the different ways of thinking about it. So it's a lot of diversity. So let me read three definitions that you can find in the CRT literature. They're prominent definitions, but you're going to notice they're very different. So here's the first one. This is one that Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanich put in their critical race theory, their introduction to critical race theory, published in 2017. And this is how they define intersectionality. Intersectionality is the belief that individuals and classes often have shared or overlapping interests or traits. That's it. So, belief that individuals and classes often have shared or overlapping interests or traits. Now, I think that a lot of us are going to hear that and go, wait, that's all? Because we're going to expect something like the second definition. Here's a second definition from Kathy Davis. She offers this in 2008 in an essay that's important and talking about the ways in which intersectionality is developed. She says, intersectionality is the interaction between gender, race, and other categories of difference in individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these interactions in terms of power. So there it's clear she's talking more about what some of us are going to expect, and we might use the phrase axes. So the axes of identification and what are the different features of my different identities, etc. But that same focus wasn't in the Delgado and Stefanich's definition. So now I want to go to a third, and this one is from Patricia Collins and Sarma Bilgi and their introduction to intersectionality from 2016. They write, intersectionality, this is a longer definition, is a way of understanding and analyzing the complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one fact. So there are multiple things that are shaping how I'm going to navigate the world and how people are going to interact with me. They are generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. So you can think about it in terms of something like a basic physics idea. There are multiple forces pushing against you. It's never just one. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, so not just class, for example, or just race, be it race or gender or class, but many axes that work together and influence each other. So they work together, they combine in certain senses, they influence each other. So they conclude intersectionality as an analytic tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves. So these are three different definitions. One was short, and the last one was quite long. And in fact, the last one just seems to, it's trying to account for a whole lot in a way that the first one wasn't. So I want to highlight this because it's very important when you're talking to people about intersectionality that you ask them, what do you mean by intersectionality? Because they in fact might even be referring to literature, but notice how different those three definitions are. So you got to ask, okay, what are you meaning by intersectionality? And then I want to say this, even though these three definitions are different, we can see that they present intersectionality as something, notice, it could be a belief or an analytic / a way of understanding the world. So those are two very different things, which considers the multiple axes of social power and how these relate to the social and legal privileges and disadvantages individuals and groups have or may experience. So again, it's a focus on multiple axes of social power and how these relate to the forms of social and legal privilege and disadvantages that individuals experience. Now, I want to note, intersectionality often gets presented as if it's only about, for example, women's issues, but that's not the case. It's also often presented as if it's only about the issues of the disadvantaged. That's not the case. It's a question about how one may have certain privileges or disadvantages, regardless of gender, regardless of class, etc. So I want to note two very different cases from the Bible that we could consider through what we might call an intersectional lens. So I want to consider Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. So think about Mary. She's a woman in a male-dominated society. She's young. She's Jewish. She's not only Jewish, she's a Jew who's under Roman colonization. She's coming from a backwater town. She's pregnant out of wedlock. She has to flee to go to Egypt, so she becomes a refugee. And it seems her family background is of the lower class. So when you think about somebody like Mary, what you're thinking about is somebody who's not really experiencing much privilege socially, and who is, in fact, in so many areas of her life, experiencing forms of exploitation, domination, subordination, etc. And these things come out even in, for example, what she has to do when there's a census, and again, when she and Joseph and Jesus have to flee to go to Egypt because of Herod's persecution. Those are the sorts of things that come because of her status, not only as a woman, but as a woman that's colonized under Roman Empire. Now let's look at the Apostle Paul. Paul is male in a male-dominated society. He is from a prominent Jewish tribe. Notice we actually don't ever learn what Jewish group Mary's from. We hear that Joseph is of the house of David, but we don't hear the same thing about Mary, whereas Paul's like, look, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, and I'm a Pharisee, so I've been holding it down. He's highly educated. Some are going to say he has the equivalent of 2 PhDs today, so highly educated, which suggests he's probably from upper middle class. He also has some serious civic religious power. And you see this, for example, in his role in the stoning of Stephen. And he's a Roman citizen. And at times he uses the privileges that come with being a Roman citizen and say, you know what, I'm taking this all the way to the tippity top. You can't just put me in prison. Take me to the Roman Empire. Take me to the emperor. I mean, this is the sort of thing he can do. That's not the kind of relationship that Mary has with Rome and the empire. So even though, for example, Paul gets persecuted, no doubt about it. He gets stoned, no doubt about it. He gets imprisoned, no doubt about it. There are certain privileges he has because he's a Roman citizen that those who aren't Roman citizens can't have. And there were certain experiences and privileges that he had because of his class and because of his tribe that enabled him to frankly, be the sort of person that could write the Pauline epistles. And again, those just aren't the kinds of advantages that Mary has. So on an intersectional note, you can, from an intersectional analysis, you can see the different kinds of challenges somebody like Mary's going to face and some of the advantages she might have. But I'm really wanting to emphasize some of the advantages that Paul could have because of his experiences. So summing up, there are competing definitions of intersectionality, but what you're certainly going to see is an emphasis on how the different features that we have tied to different components of our identity are the sorts of things that are going to track with socially, as it were, determined privileges and disadvantages.
I really like how you brought up Mary, especially when you think of Mary's song, right?
Yeah.
That really makes it shine, where you see someone who's from such a not privileged position being able to say that she is blessed by God. So that's powerful.
That's exactly right. And her emphasis on Jesus as a liberator. That's exactly right. That stuff makes more sense when you're thinking about her as a colonized person. But no, you're right. When God goes through the angel says, yes, you're blessed. Like, whoa. I'm reminded of those who ended up becoming Jesus' disciples who say, wait, can anything good come out of Nazareth? These are the sorts of social ideas that accompany somebody like Mary. So yeah, no, you're right. The Magnificat is in many ways magnificent because of some of these distinctive experiences of social disadvantage that Mary has.
And, CRT has, like I mentioned earlier, it's been a discussion, argument point in some church communities, usually white evangelical communities. There's been things like, people listing the pros, listing the cons, some saying it's entirely incompatible with the gospel, some people saying it's completely compatible. What's really at stake in those kinds of conversations and arguments going on within some church communities?
Yeah, so I want to highlight 5 things that I think are at stake. Here's the first one. It's a matter of neighbor love. So how we interact with our critical race theorist neighbors, the extent to which we engage them justly, is a matter of how well we're going to love them. And I want to say we have to ask this question: are we loving our critical race theory neighbors in our interactions with them in their scholarship? And a lot of times, I'm going to be blunt, the answer is no. And this is even from those who might advocate in some senses for critical race theory, but they don't make extended stays in the scholarship. They talk without knowing much. And often it causes so much harm. So I think in these cases, one of the things we have to see is if we're not really doing due diligence, really giving our critical race theorist neighbors what they're owed, what we owe them, then we're likely to be in sin against them and against God. So I see this as a matter of neighbor love and therefore also a question of whether we're in sin or not. The second thing I want to say is we can miss out on an opportunity to learn about how U.S. law and legal institutions maintain forms and have maintained forms of white supremacy, white normativity, oppression, and subordination along racialized lines. So even if we don't end up agreeing with everything that critical race theorists teach, and by the way, not all critical race theorists agree. This is one of the things I'm trying to highlight. There's a lot of difference of opinion. If we don't engage justly and lovingly with them, then we're going to miss out on opportunities to learn about the insights that they have to teach us. So I often talk about the importance of taking a posture of humility and one of teachability. So I'm coming with expectations when I'm reading my critical race theorist neighbors. I'm wondering, well, what are the things that you have to teach me that you're seeing that I'm not yet seeing? And in particular, what are those things about U.S. laws that you're seeing that I haven't seen? Now I want to get into something that's hard, and this is the third thing. That is the ways in which people are discussing CRT. You had mentioned earlier, Brother Timothy, about how it's seen as a boogeyman or a boogie woman. Like I think, in part, the phrase is getting thrown around without much understanding and in a way that's causing extreme division. So again, whether or not you're going to agree with everything that any individual critical race theorist teaches, that's something that you'd have to figure out as you're working through it. But because of how little engagement people are giving to critical race theory and how they're using it in some ways like the Red Scare of Marxism back in the earlier 20th century, it's becoming a hyper divisive thing, and you're seeing this, frankly, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention, where there are now just this week multiple churches that are predominantly African Americans that are leaving, and it's not so much because they're saying, yeah, we really understand critical race theory, we're completely with critical race theory, but largely they're saying, if you're not even going to give this movement its due diligence as it's trying to offer helpful resources to understand systemic racism, what are we talking about when we're saying that we're really against racism in terms of the SBC making a stand against racism? So I think the discussions, especially because of how poorly they're being held, are fostering a lot of division. And let's be honest, it's racialized division. It's typically, as you had mentioned earlier, those that are most against critical race theory, whether they know much about it or not, are going to be racialized white, not exclusively, of course, but for the most part. And then those that are more hopeful about the potential that critical race theory as a movement is going to have insights are going to be racialized minorities. So there's a racial division. And unfortunately, a lot of the divisions are playing out in denominations that still have not really worked through their very racist histories. The other thing I want to note is we're missing an opportunity, in some ways picking back up on point 2 about understanding how U.S. law works. We're missing an opportunity to broaden understanding of sins of omission. So what are the ways in which, for example, we could learn from critical race theorists about how forms of Christianity in Jim and Jane Crow and Juan and Juanita Crow era, how can we learn about how forms of Christianity really just got constructed so that they were compatible with those forms of racial apartheid? So how can we learn about all these sins of omission? How can we learn from our critical race theorists, brothers and sisters, about how this even happened? What kinds of theories, what kinds of ways of seeing, what kind of practices have to be up and running so that you can have people who are proclaiming the name of Christ, who are saying we need to be against oppression, also saying, okay, I want the help. You got to be over there. No, you got to swim in your pool, not in the white pool, et cetera, et cetera. Got to ask these sorts of questions. And again, I'm not just talking about sins of commission, where we're actively doing things, but what are the ways in which we fail to promote forms of just, merciful, loving anti-racism? And the last thing I want to say is connected to that. We need to take an opportunity to learn from our critical race theorist neighbors so that we can deepen our understanding of church and therefore family history. So I'll give you one example. The indigenous critical race theorist, Robert Williams, Jr., who's of the Lumbee tribe, he teaches at Arizona Law. He has written a dynamite book about the different discourses about indigenous peoples that you find perpetuated throughout what we would call the West. And I'd say the first 3/4 of the book are all about the discourses that get promoted within the Church Catholic. Going back, in fact, thinking about papal authority, going all the way back to the 2nd century, the different ideas that people were developing about papal authority, see how those get connected to the Crusades, and then how from the Crusades it gets connected to what ends up being the spread of European colonialism. And he pays detailed attention to the debates within the church about race, racism, racial subordination, conquest, heathenism. You have people saying, for example, if somebody doesn't accept Christianity, the first time you offer it, natural law requires that they're executed, or natural law at least allows that you conquer them. And these are Christians making these sorts of arguments. So critical race theorists give us opportunities to learn this part of history, this part of church history that typically doesn't get discussed in, say, like seminaries or in Sunday school classes, and repent. And also try to perform modes of remediation to say, okay, what has the church done that's been wrong? And I'm thinking of somebody like Daniel, who ends up repenting of the sins of Israel. Like, what are the things that Israel's done wrong? So what are the things that the church has done wrong? And how can we try to resist and remediate future iterations of these kinds of evils?
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that last point there, some Christians are a little bit wary of the idea of systemic sin or systemic racism, and they see that as being a kind of a tenet of CRT. Can you help us define what systemic sin, systemic racism is, and is that exclusively a CRT thing, or is it found elsewhere?
Yeah, another great question. Y'all are asking such good questions, making me put in the work today. So let me start with this one. Critical race theorists don't write about, and I want to put it in quotations, sin, systemic or otherwise. That's not their focus. They're going to write about forms of injustice and evil tied to oppression, subordination, discrimination, exploitation, etc. Now, that's the first thing to note. Second thing to note is those very evils and injustices I've described are what Christians historically have argued are forms of sin. Forms of sin. So though critical race theorists aren't explicitly calling these things sin, if you draw on the church's history and theological teachings, say, oh, okay, hold on. Things like oppression, subordination, exploitation, discrimination. Okay, these are deemed injustices and therefore sin. So this takes us to the third thing I want to say. We can think about systemic sin as an instance in which a society or a community is organized such that it fosters and perpetuates things like oppression, subordination, discrimination, and exploitation. So, for example, consider in Leviticus 24:22, God commands Israel to make sure that the same laws that they have are applied to the foreigners. So the same law for the foreigner as for the native born. So there's a vision about what a legal system needs to look like. You can't have it so that if you're native born to Israel, you get one thing. If you're a foreigner, you get some other thing. If you were to have it that way, then what you have is a sinful legal system. And we could talk about it as an instance of systemic sin. So I want to note that you get similar focus on legal systems in Leviticus 19:15. So in fact, the Old Testament pays a lot of attention to legal systems. So there are some good questions to ask about how some of the concerns that you're going to find, especially in the Mosaic Covenant, get replicated in terms of discussions of legal problems in the United States. It's a good question to ask. I want to note, too, in Exodus 22, verses 25 through 27, it's pretty clear. The Mosaic Covenant is saying there are certain systemic, evil, and so sinful loaning practices that Israel should not participate in. So you have certain legal concerns, and you also have questions about loans and interest. And another example, you can see this in James 5, 4, and so chapter 5, verse 4, and Deuteronomy 24, 14 through 15, there's an emphasis on how system and practices of low or delayed wages, that's sinful. So there's a whole practice and way of giving people less than they're owed, or of delaying the payment. Okay, no, this whole system would support that. That's sinful and evil. That's the sort of thing that the people have need to be against. So I want to say this. Given what I've highlighted, we can say, okay, yeah, no, it's not the case that concerns about systemic sins are distinctive or unique to critical race theory. Nope, I think we see good reasons to say there are those kinds of concerns about systemic evils all the way back in the Mosaic Covenant. But I also want to say the concerns about systemic evils and about what we might go on to call systemic sins aren't only discussed in, for example, critical race theory, but you're going to find a range of scholarship on race and sociology and philosophy and political science talking about the problems of systemic evils. So, for example, you'll see them discussing the evils of U.S. racial apartheid, talking about, for example, the ways in which you get a racial apartheid between those that are seen as white settlers and those that are seen as indigenous peoples in the very beginning of the United States, and racial apartheid when you get the rise of Jim and Jane Crow after Plessy v. Ferguson, where it gets really formally established. So they're going to say, whether you're a critical race theorist or not, what we have are clear examples of systems of evil and racialized evil at that. And then the last example I want to note is the 1987 case, Kemp versus Mccleskey, where the Supreme Court says, yeah, we know it's going to be the case that more racialized blacks are going to be wrongly found guilty of murder and are going to be at higher rates than other racialized groups wrongly found guilty and also given the death penalty. But we're going to roll with it. Well, that's going to be an example of a clear systemic problem where the courts are acknowledging, yep, there are these clear cases of racialized inequity, but we're just going to live with it. And now you're going to get an entire legal system that's, in certain senses, presuming, yep, this is what's going to happen, and it continues to go forward. So those are some examples, both from scripture and then examples from history, where, again, people in political science and sociology, they're going to be thinking through things like U.S. racial apartheid or Mccleskey versus Kemp.
Awesome, that's great. We're going to pivot now to something we've promised is that we would answer. Actually, I won't answer. Nathan, you'll be answering some questions that have been sent in by the viewers here. So the first question I have here is by Faye. So shout out to Faye. What are some loving responses that we can give to people who accuse us of advocating CRT when we're actually just talking about justice?
Great question. A few thoughts come to mind. So one is we need to remember that circumstances matter. So somebody comes to you and accuses you of advocating for CRT when you're just talking about justice. You have to ask, where are you? With whom are you talking? What's your role in this place or this community, etc.? It's going to be an important set of questions to consider. And then we have to realize, and this is tough, but it's true, sometimes it's wise and loving to answer a person by defending yourself. But other times it's wise and loving not to respond with much more than something like this. I don't want to have this conversation right now. It's all going to depend on what you perceive to be the nature of your interlocutor, the person that's coming at you, as we would have said in New Jersey. Some people they're gonna accuse you of something, but it's clear they have a posture of hearing you out and saying, like, I think you're championing critical race theory, and I'm a little concerned. That might be the response. Or, oh my gosh, look at you, you're just a critical race theorist, and those people are Marxist lunatics. Okay, what kind of conversation are you gonna be able to have? Again, you got to ask, like, what's your role? What's the community, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to discern: is it wise and is it loving to defend ourselves in certain ways, or do we need to take a step back and say, no, you know what, I can't answer a fool according to the fool's folly right now. It's hard to discern that, but this is one of the things I'd want to highlight. And then I want to say this: let's presume it is wise and it is loving to answer this accusation. I think you could say something like this. You can say, I'm not talking about the theories or positions that derive from nor unique to critical race theory. I'm presuming that's the case. You're not actually trying to champion anything that's distinctive to critical race theory. So you can say, I'm not advocating any positions that derive from or unique to critical race theory. And you could talk about, for example, how somebody like Albert Rabbitoe discusses the racialization of law in the United States. He's a Greek Orthodox brother. And you could say, yeah, look, if I read Rabbitoe's Slave Religion, I'm seeing these are problems. And this is U.S. religious history. This isn't critical race theory. You could think about somebody like Toni Morrison and her great literary criticism book, Playing in the Dark. You could say, no, I'm championing ideas from Sister Toni Morrison. That's also not critical race theory. Now, I want to say, if that's what you're doing, great. But I also want to caution against what I see as this rise in the desire to distance oneself from critical race theory, even though you don't know anything about critical race theory, and say like, oh, we don't need critical race theory at all. We can just focus on something that Rabbitoh or Winthrop Jordan or Toni Morrison or maybe Angela Davis that they gave us. And I want to say, wait a second. We have to ask, is that track promoting love of our critical race theorist neighbors, or is it promoting injustice towards our critical race theorist neighbors? Now, if you don't know anything about CRT, that's okay. Just be honest. That's not my specialty. I don't know. But I do know Rabbitoh and I do know Morrison, for example. But let's be very careful about saying, oh, we don't even need this movement. We can just deal with forms of racism and promote forms of anti-racism without knowing anything about this at all. Okay, yes, you can do some of that. I wouldn't deny that. But my question would be, what is your posture towards critical race theory as a movement, especially towards your critical race theory neighbors?
That's great. Let's see. One other question we got here.
Can I interrupt real quick before we get too off course? Someone in the chat named Noah, I think Dr. Cartagena, you were mentioning like a last case example. I think you said the Supreme Court. What was the name of that case again?
Kemp versus Mccleskey.
One more time?
Kemp versus Mccleskey.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Timothy. I just didn't want to get too off course or we forgot that part.
Sure. Awesome. So we have a question here from Leon in the chat. He's asking, some argue that CRT is a secular ideology, and that's why it shouldn't be used by Christians. So can you speak about other secular philosophies or ideas in Western theology that are being used in Western theology?
Yeah. That's a great question. Let me take a step back. I sometimes do this. I flip the order. So the case is Mccleskey versus Kemp, 1987. And I was saying Kemp versus Mccleskey. But yeah, so sorry about that. This sometimes happens. Anyway, so in terms of questions about ideology, so in some ways, we have to see that the church has wrestled throughout its history with thinking about to what extent, if at all, Christians should endorse ideas, positions, frameworks, claims from what we're going to deem non-Christian groups. So I'll note two examples of this. One, you get what I call the Tertullian model, which is going to, you got Brother Tertullian who's going to ask a question like, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? So what does Greek philosophy have to do with any of this stuff that we're trying to do in terms of champion Christ? That's one option. And then you have somebody like Clement from Alexandria who's going to say, all truth is God's truth. So if these people are saying anything that's true, like these are things that the Lord is happy for us to learn, let's learn them and learn about God and learn about what we might call the ways in which God has revealed God's self through general and special revelation. So through the scriptures, through Christ, through the prophets and the apostles, but also through things like what Calvin will call the theater of creation. So you have two differing views that run all the way up to present day throughout the church's history. This is one thing to see. Second thing to see is throughout history, the church has drawn on different philosophies. So I want to be careful with how we're thinking about ideology. Sometimes it only has a negative connotation. So I'm going to switch to the phrase philosophy. It has used different philosophies to articulate Christian theology. So you see this in the creeds, for example. So in the formation of the creeds and in the early church councils, certain forms of Platonic philosophy, certain forms of Stoic philosophy are very important. And what you find is the church is drawing from certain categories that are available to them from the Platonic or Stoic philosophies of their day, and saying, okay, yeah, no, we can think about homoousios versus homoousios, so of the same substance versus of similar substances. Right? You're not going to find substance discussions full-blown in Old or New Testament. But what our historic sisters and brothers are going to say is, okay, but that's getting at the same idea. Similar to what I've done when we were talking about intersectionality, you can say, oh, well, if I use this intersectional lens, I can understand somebody like Ruth better, or I can understand Mary better, or Paul better. And then the other thing I want to say is, a lot of times Christians have used visions about how we draw and implement insights from non-Christian groups in ways that are troubling. And here's what I mean. So though I'm a huge Augustine fan, Augustine talks about plundering the Egyptians and trying to find Egyptian gold. Now, he's referring to something that happens in Exodus, where it ends up that there's a kind of plundering that goes on when Israel's leaving, and they're able to get all sorts of wealth from the Egyptians, and they use that to craft the tabernacle. So that's part of Augustine's idea. He's like, look, you can take all these things and you can use it to make something that's beautiful and glorifying to God. But I want to caution about how we think of interacting with things that aren't coming from distinctively Christian groups. Because if we just go around talking about plundering all day, well, we're right back into a certain kind of colonizing conquest motif. And we have to ask, even if there are truths in these groups, how do we relate justly to the groups that have given these insights? And so here I think about one mode that I think is a better way of talking about this, but it's still a bit problematic. And this is one that Boethius and Thomas Aquinas talk about. They talk about taking water and turning it into theological wine. So they're thinking about what Jesus does with water. And I want to highlight, when they use this analogy, this metaphor, what they're stressing is the original thing is life-giving and nourishing. But there's an important sense in which it gets enhanced when it gets brought up into distinctively Christian registers. So they're still trying to pay difference to the water, saying that this is good even before we start thinking in the distinctively Christian ways about it. But then once we start thinking about these things in distinctively Christian ways, well, then we can talk about, for example, how, as I would argue, the Spirit is not only a liberating spirit, but the Spirit is a spirit that illumines human reflection. So I would argue that the Spirit is an agent of race-conscious justice and mercy. So I'm taking certain ideas about race consciousness, that's water for me, and I'm thinking in a very distinctively Christian register, and thinking like, okay, yeah, if the Spirit is the agent of liberation and illumination, oh yeah, okay, well, the Spirit would be the one that's helping to promote just, merciful, loving forms of race consciousness.
That's super helpful. I think we have time for one more question here. This one is from David. Actually, I know this David, so hey, David. So he says, I believe at the start of Dr. Cartagena's mentioned the creation of the category of race. Could he explain this a bit more?
Yes. Okay, that's a great question. So we need to see that the category of race is a colonial construct. People haven't always racialized themselves or others. They didn't see themselves as race. They might have seen themselves as belonging to certain tribes, to certain nations, to certain peoples, but seeing yourself and others as race happens at a particular historic moment. And that moment happens to be in Portugal in the 15th century, 1444. You're going to get the beginnings of what race scholars are going to call, I've just blanked on what it's called, racial, it's like a racial spectrum. That's not the right word, I apologize, I'm blanking on what it's called. But it's the beginnings of thinking through who counts as white, who counts as something that's not white, but then especially we're going to have this category black, it's at the bottom. And so in fact, in 1444, you get the very first recorded, explicit, racialized construction of white supremacy by a chronicler for the Portuguese king. His name is Azuara, and he's going to say, look, we had some people coming from Africa that are on this slave ship, and they're being sold because they were captured, and they were seen to be captured justly in a just war against, in particular, Muslims in North Africa. And they're going to say, well, we had some that are white, and so fair and pleasant to look upon. And then they're the mulattoes. There's not much that they say about those. So those are those that are going to be seen as somewhere in between whiteness and blackness. And then there are those that they say are like the Ethiops, which is a Greek for burnt-faced. And it talks about how they look like they were from the lower hemisphere, which is it's a racist way of saying it looked like they're from hell. So already, racial scale, that's what it's called. Sorry, it took me forever to get that, a racial scale. So you see that. But then it's actually not until in 1512, and the laws of Burgos, that are a Spanish construction, is you get the first ever legal racial category. It's the Indian. So the laws of Burgos created by the Spanish, are the first ever legal racialized construction and categorization of two racial groups. There are the Indians and there are the white Spaniards. And you're going to find, because of the influence that Spain and Portugal and others are going to have, these ideas are getting shot all over the place. So you're going to get distinctive ways of racializing throughout global history. So that, for example, at times, Irish people are seen as black, and at times they're seen as white. At times, Chinese people are seen as white. At times, they're seen as yellow. At times, they're seen as black. So they get racialized in very different ways. At times, those from Mexico are seen as these nasty hybrids that you should want to have nothing to do with. And then other times, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the United States has frankly engaged in this unjust war, has been able to take huge swaths of Mexico, well, because they say that all the people that are part of this treaty are now going to be able to become U.S. citizens, those same Mexicanos and Mexicanas that were seen as these nasty hybrids and so not white, well, if they're going to be U.S. citizens, what do they have to be? Given what we said earlier, they have to be seen as white. So that's an example of construction of whiteness by legal fiat. So they're deemed white, but it's a wild kind of white, because even though the law says, well, okay, in some ways, since you're U.S. citizens, you got to be white, people aren't treating those Mexicanos and Mexicanas like they're white. And you can see how that continues to play out today. And I'll highlight, there are ways in which we have to see that these categories that get constructed during European colonialism are very fluid, as you can tell that I've been highlighting. And so you have to ask, in any particular historical moment, who's getting racialized as white? What's seen to be connected to whiteness? And what is seen as being disparate, distinct from whiteness? And then what are the graded scales? So it's not enough to say, okay, these things are different. But, for example, it's typically the case that Latinos and African Americans are going to be racialized not only as inferior, but as intellectually inferior to whites. That's not a racialization pattern that holds very often for those that are racialized as Asian. They're not typically going to be racialized in a way that's going to see them as intellectually inferior. However, they're especially racialized Asian men. They might be racialized so that they're seen as, okay, yeah, like they're not all that sexual. They're not all that interested in sex. Whereas those are going to be racialized as black or Latinos and Latinas, they're going to be like, oh man, these people are like hypersexual. So you get very different conceptions of racialization, and you get different levels of access / a graded scale, I want to get back to that, towards what's seen as normative and frankly historically seen as white. So I hope that helps to answer, it was David's question about racial construction.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. Again, Nathan, it's been a great roller coaster ride going through CRT with you. So I'm really grateful for you giving your time. Grateful to the listeners for listening. Nicola, do you have any last words for us before we close out here?
Yeah, so I just want to thank you again, Dr. Cartagena, for participating in our first live virtual event. We really appreciate that. And we just hope, you folks that tuned in, that, you were encouraged or edified, or maybe some of the clouds rolled back a bit as you listened to the discussion. So thank all of you for tuning in. I know it's Friday night. You probably want to go kick back and watch a movie or, a sports program or something. So we do appreciate you tuning in. Thanks, Timothy, again for, keeping in conversation with Dr. Cartagena. So thanks again, everyone. And I guess till next time.